What I'm going to be presenting is I'm going to present a view of the lunar sabbaths that shows that the lunar sabbaths are not biblical and not historical and not true. And what we're going to do is we're going to look through the Bible, and then we're going to look at history and examine if these things have ever been kept by the Jews or if they've ever been kept in history at all. And I'm sure by the end of it we'll see that they're not biblical. They don't hold up to investigation. In short, a new moon is really the beginning of a month in the Bible. And our brother already mentioned some of this. It's the first or the new day of the month. That's Ezekiel 46:1, which you read earlier. The Hebrew word for months in the following text is the word Kodesh. And it's from Strong's 2320. It means the new moon. And the beginning of this day is marked by a particular phase of the moon. The Jews marked it by the first visible crescent after the change of the moon. And the change usually happens when the moon is out here. It gets dark, and then you'll start to see the first visible crescent come. And that's called your new moon day. That was what the new moon was. And you can see it here in the picture. And so we've got a bunch of different phases. And as it goes around the earth, it takes 29 and a half days for this to take place as it goes around. And so what you have here is a half moon, and then you have your full moon, and then it comes back and you have another half moon, and then you get back to the dark moon. And the first crescent is called the new moon day. And so that's how a new moon works, and it usually works every 29 and a half days. It'll either be 29 or 30 days in a month. Now, the Bible says in Numbers 10, verse 3, "Make you 2 trumpets of silver, of a whole piece shalt thou make them, that you may use them for the calling of the assembly." So these are assemblies here, as we'll get to. "And the trumpet was blown on the new moon. They shall blow with them, all the assembly shall assemble themselves to thee at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation." Numbers chapter 10 and verse 3. Now in Numbers 10, verse 10, you keep reading, and it says, "Also in the day of your gladness, in your solemn days, and in the beginning of your months." And that's what the new moon is. The Hebrew word there is the Kodesh, which is the new moon day. These were days, it says, where you shall blow the trumpets. And what was the trumpet given for? It was for an assembly, right? There was an assembly on the new moon days. And they would offer offerings, sacrifices, etc. on these days. Now in 1 Chronicles chapter 23, verse 31, it says to offer all burnt sacrifices to the Lord in the Sabbaths, in the new moons, and on the set feasts. So Sabbaths and new moons are always distinguished between each other. The Sabbath is not the new moon, and the new moon is not a Sabbath. Some people that keep the lunar Sabbath believe a new moon is a Sabbath. Some don't call it a Sabbath, and they're coming to where they used to, when they first started becoming a big movement, they used to believe the new moon was actually a Sabbath. But Colossians 2:16 talks about the new moons. It says in the New Testament, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days." And usually when the term new moon is used in the Bible, it's used in context with the Sabbath days. The Sabbaths are always mentioned, and that is a weekly Sabbath, I believe. I don't believe it's an annual Sabbath. I'll get to that as I continue. Isaiah 66, 22 and 23 says, "As the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain, and it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord." So when we get to heaven, we will be keeping a Sabbath, and we will come to the tree of life every month, which means Kodesh, new moon, and we'll eat that tree. The tree is going to produce 12 manner of fruits, which we will eat of every month. Now, some of our pioneers taught about this. Ellen White, she said, "God teaches that we should assemble," so these are our assemblies, new moons and Sabbaths, "in his house to cultivate the attributes of perfect love. This will fit dwellers of earth for the mansions that Christ has gone to prepare for all who love him. There they will assemble in the sanctuary from Sabbath to Sabbath, from one new moon to another, in loftiest strains of song, praise, thanksgiving to him who sits upon the throne and to the Lamb forever and ever." So I believe we will keep a new moon in a new heaven. James White also said, when the restorer shall have, James White is the husband of Ellen White, he said, "When the restorer shall have established the immortal saints in a new earth, it will count its revolutions and the sun and moon will measure off days and months and years, as long as eternal ages shall roll. The redeemed will have right to the tree of life, which Adam lost through disobedience. That tree yields 12 manner of fruits each month. And why may not the words of the prophet in reference to all flesh appearing before the Lord from one new moon to another, and be fulfilled when the entire family of the redeemed shall come each month to take of the new fruit of the tree of life? So when will they assemble in a new heaven and new earth, from Sabbath to Sabbath, new moon to new moon? Is it okay if I just move this TV a little bit this way? Just turn it? Because it's a little hard for me to see from that angle. And probably for you guys as well. Is that okay? It's better? Now, Jay and Andrews, all flesh shall come to worship before Jehovah from Sabbath to Sabbath, from new moon to new moon. Then it is possible for the human family to observe the Sabbath over the whole globe. We appeal to see if it be so, all flesh will have the Sabbath and the tree of life as first designed, both of which were made before the fall. The tree of life shall yield its fruit every month, and thus shall its fruit be ready for those who shall come up from one new moon to another. So some of our pioneers believe that we would be keeping new moons in heaven, and for those who believe it's nailed to the cross with the feast days, Sabbaths, new moons, feast days, I don't believe that the Sabbaths and new moons are nailed to the cross, and I don't believe there's verses that say that the feasts are nailed to the cross. I see it as let no man judge you in respect to how you keep them in Colossians 2:16. Now, Revelation 22:1, he showed me a pure river of water of life. This is the last chapter in the Bible. Clear as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb, and in the midst of the street of it, and on either side of the river was there the tree of life, which bare 12 manner of fruits, and yielded her fruit every month. And the Greek there is the same word for Kodesh in Hebrew, which is every new moon. And so when we get to heaven, we will come to the tree of life every new moon. Now these things are true. And again, this is your cycle of the moon as it goes around the earth. And that's usually one day every cycle there, and then it comes back to a dark moon because you can't see the light side of the moon when it gets in front of the earth. Now this happens about every 29 or 30 days that this moon makes its cycle around the earth. So as it comes back around, some have said that they begin their Sabbath count from the first day of the month or the new moon and keep the Sabbath every 7 days after. And some use the dark moon rather than the crescent. So from different people, you'll find different days. There was a feast last month where lunar Sabbath keepers came together, and they had 4 different Sabbaths: Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. There's the lunar Sabbath keepers, I don't believe, are understanding all there is to understand about this issue, and that's why they're all over the place in regards to keeping their Sabbaths. Now, a lunar Sabbath is not the first day of the month. The first day of the month is called the new moon day. And they believe that it always falls usually right here, and then you count 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And so the Sabbath would fall for them on the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th. These are all Sabbaths to them. Now for us, our new moon can fall here, here, here. In regards to the week, it can fall any day of the week. And that's the difference that we have with the lunar Sabbath keepers. We don't believe that the Sabbath always falls on this day. And that's what I'll get to. And I'll show that this is not scriptural nor historical to always have the weekly Sabbath on the 15th. Now God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament." How do lunar Sabbatarians attempt to prove the Sabbath is calculated from the new moon? There is no commandment that says, for in 6 days the Lord created heaven and earth and rested the 7th day. It doesn't say anything about the new moon in the commandment. There's no mention of the new moon. It doesn't say start counting your 7-day Sabbaths from the new moon. The commandment does not do this. But God did say, "Let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years." So what is implied, or what they believe this implies, is that every day should be counted from the sun, the moon, and the stars. And that includes the Sabbath day. This is reading into the text a little bit. We can definitely use the sun to calculate each day, and that's a cycle, a day. But We don't use it to calculate our Sabbaths, and we'll get to this. But this is another verse that's used. It's Isaiah 66, 22 and 23. It says, "As the new heavens and new earth which I shall make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain, and it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord." Now they believe that this implies that because they're used together, all Sabbaths fall in count with the new moon day. And they believe that the new moon day is the first day of the month, and therefore the 8th day is a Sabbath, the 15th day is a Sabbath, the 22nd, and they count their cycle from the new moon because this verse connects a new moon with a Sabbath. But does this verse say to make sure to start your count at the new moon? Do any verses in the Bible say to start counting the weekly cycle at the new moon? There's nowhere in the Bible that says to count your weekly cycle from the new moon. That's not biblical. It's assumptions. And we got to be careful with assumptions. It's kind of like when we read, we've talked about several different issues this week, like the Trinity, and we read 1 John 5:7. We assume God, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and they add the term God there. These are assumptions, and we have to be careful not to build doctrines on assumptions. We have to build on what does the Word of God really say. So this implies that if your new moon falls on a Sunday, then every day here on this under this week is called Sunday. If your new moon falls on Monday, then every day here your Sabbath would be on Monday, or your Sabbath would be on Wednesday. It depends on what day the new moon falls on every month, but every month your Sabbath will change from one month to another. So next month you might be keeping Wednesday as your Sabbath, and next month you might be keeping Sunday. And that's all dependent on the moon. That's what they believe as lunar Sabbatarians. The Bible says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor, do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that in them is, and rested the Sabbath day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." Now you'll notice something that is mentioned in this commandment, and that is creation. God created the world in 7 days. And earlier we said there was a presentation that said that God had the first day started before the 7-day week of creation. I don't believe that. I believe the evening and the morning were the first day, and that's not the second day, as the presenter said in the last presentation. And the reason that they have to do that is because in order to get to the 7th day, well, the 7th day has to be the 8th day, so they say there's an extra day in creation. There's nowhere in the Bible that says this. This is, again, assumptions. It's implied because, and not just that, but the moon was created or made on the 4th day. Genesis chapter 1 says it. We're having to do a lot of tricks and move a lot of things around and change a lot of the meanings of words and do a lot of things in order to keep this lunar Sabbath. It's definitely changing words in the Bible. And the moon was definitely not created to the 4th day. It wasn't here. It wasn't on the first day of creation. That's the first day of creation is here. There's nowhere in the Bible that says the new moon was the first day and then we started the second day here. That's not biblical. 6 days the Lord created. Now, Ellen White talks about this creation. She says, "I was then carried back to the creation and was shown that the first week in which God performed the work of creation in 6 days and rested on the 7th day was just like every other week. The great God in his days of creation and day of rest measured off the first cycle as a sample for successive weeks till the close of time. The weekly cycle of 7 literal days, 6 for labor and 7 for rest, which has been preserved and brought down through Bible history, originated in the great fact of the first 7 days." Now that's what I believe, is that there has been a continuous weekly cycle. Now, if you were to believe this doctrine, there should be one more day here. But basically, if you were to believe this cycle here, you'll end up not having a Sabbath here or here, and then you end up waiting another week, and then you have to go to another week, almost 9 days sometimes, until your next Sabbath. This that breaks your weekly cycle every month. That is an unbroken cycle of successive weeks till the close of time. And that's 1 Spirit of Prophecy 85. Now some say that after the Exodus there was a Sabbath on the 15th day of the month, every month for 3 months in a row. And we're going to look at the first month, because if I prove the first month is wrong, it doesn't matter about the rest of them, because what it is the first month, well, this would be the Passover day right here, and the first month would be the 15th, which is supposed to be a Sabbath. It's absolutely a Sabbath. We'll get to this, but is it a weekly or an annual, or is it both? And we'll see whether or not it is a weekly, annual, or both as we go. And the Bible proves this very, very clearly. Now, my belief is that this day here, when the Exodus, is not weekly. And I want to make this clear from the Bible. It's not a weekly Sabbath. It definitely was not, and I'll show you why as we continue. And if it's not a weekly Sabbath, that implies that this day here is not always a weekly Sabbath. And that destroys the whole argument of the lunar Sabbath right there, if that day is not a weekly Sabbath. Because that's what they use. And as you saw in the last presentation, if that's all that we have, then and that falls apart and that's not a weekly Sabbath, then we can't say that every 15th is a weekly Sabbath. Now, in Leviticus 23, the Bible tells us that the 14th of the first month is the Passover. So the 14th is the Passover day. In the 15th day, the first and 7th month is to be an annual Sabbath. You'll find this in Leviticus 23, verse 6 to 8 and verse 39. Down at the bottom of the screen, we have verse 39. It says, the 15th day of the 7th month, when you've gathered in the fruit of your land, you shall keep the feast unto the Lord 7 days. On the first day shall be a Sabbath, and on the 8th day shall be a Sabbath. So that would be definitely Sabbaths here. These are Sabbaths. In the first month and the 7th month. We will not deny this fact. These are Sabbaths. So that is a Sabbath. But is there different kinds of Sabbaths? Is there weekly and is there annual? Are there different kinds of Sabbaths? Let's take a look as to whether or not these Sabbaths are always weekly Sabbaths. Let's look at the calendar here. The Lord spake to Moses when he came out of Egypt, and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Exodus 12, 1 and 2. So what we're looking at is the first month. If we show that the 15th day of this first month, where they exited Egypt, is not a weekly Sabbath, then that implies the 15th is not always a weekly Sabbath. And the 7-day cycle is not connected to the new moon. 7 days shall ye eat unleavened bread. First day, 15th, you shall put away leaven out of your houses. For whosoever eateth leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. Exodus 12, 15. Now in the first day there shall be a holy convocation. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever. Now they brought them out of Egypt on the 15th day. It's very important to remember because there's a lot of traveling going on the 15th day. So therefore, there must have been a lot of things they had to carry out of Egypt and bring out of their houses. Now this was definitely an annual Sabbath. It's the 15th day that they were brought out of Egypt. Now is this a weekly Sabbath? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. Is it a weekly Sabbath? Now it says here in Numbers chapter 33, they departed from Ramses in the first month on the 15th day of the first month. On the morrow after the Passover, the children of Israel went out with a high hand in the sight of all the Egyptians. So what do we got here? We got definitely it's the 15th day, and the 15th day, according to Leviticus 23, is a Sabbath. Now let's look at these things. It says in Jeremiah 17:21, thus saith the Lord, take heed to yourselves and bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem. What does that mean? Bear no burden. You're not to travel. You're not to pick up all your things and start moving out of your house on the Sabbath day. That's what it means. There's no traveling on the Sabbath day. And Jericho is a different instance. It was only half a mile around, so be careful with that. It wasn't like they traveled all the way around a giant city. It was only half a mile. You can look that up on Google. Now, no traveling on Sabbath. Does it mean we can't go for a little walk or something like that. No, it means don't grab all your burdens, do all your work, try to pick up all your things on the Sabbath. Now the weekly Sabbath, if you read it in Leviticus 23 verse 3, you'll notice something about the words here. We've got two different words. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of rest, a holy convocation. You shall do how much work here on the weekly Sabbath? No work. Therein. It is a Sabbath of the Lord in your dwelling. So he just told you what you can't do. You can't do any work at all on the weekly Sabbath. That's verse 3. Then you go down to verse 7 and it talks about the annual Sabbath. It's a little different. And that's what I'm saying. The weekly and the annual are different. They're not the same, because in the first day, you shall have a holy convocation. That's the 15th day of the month. You shall do how much work? No servile work. So this is a lesser restriction than the weekly Sabbath. You see that? Why would God command you to do no work in the very verse 3 on the weekly Sabbath, and then if this is a weekly Sabbath too, command a lesser restriction right after he just commanded you to do no work at all? You see, the reason why is because these are different days. They're not the same. This is a weekly, this is an annual Sabbath. So the 15th is an annual Sabbath. And not just that, but I'm going to show you it couldn't have fell on that day when they came out of Egypt, the weekly Sabbath. But he said to them, this is that which the Lord has said, tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which ye will bake, seethe that which ye will seethe, and that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept to the morning. Now what God was teaching them here was 6 days you would gather the manna, cook it, bake it, and have it ready before the Sabbath. You'd get a double portion on the 6th day, and then you wouldn't cook on the Sabbath. You wouldn't bake any food on the Sabbath. There's no cooking or baking. God taught us this in Exodus chapter 16. So there's no cooking or baking on the Sabbath. But what about the annual Sabbath, the 15th day, right here? Could they cook and bake? Exodus 12 again. We're back to Exodus 12 on the Exodus. And it says, they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they brought forth out of Egypt. For it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry, neither had they prepared for themselves any victual. So what do we see on this 15th here? When they came out of Egypt, we see cooking, we see baking. So that means that it wasn't the Sabbath. It wasn't the weekly Sabbath, because you're allowed to cook on the 15th. There's no preparation on the feast Sabbath. There's no preparation day for those days. The Bible doesn't teach that. Again, they departed from Ramses in the first month on the 15th day of the first month. Now, a lot of lunar Sabbath keepers are going to a daylight Sabbath, and they're saying, well, it was only the 15th from the morning to evening. But I want you guys to notice something as you're looking at this. It's not just morning to evening. It actually included the night was the 15th. It says, when did they depart from Ramses? In the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, on the morrow, after the Passover, children of Israel went out with a high hand in the night in the sight of the Egyptians. Now, they're teaching that day is only used in reference to daylight hours. Is this true here? Let's actually look at the Exodus and let's see if this is true. Is this biblical? Exodus 12:42. It says, it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the self-same day, it came to pass that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night to be much observed unto the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. So the 15th would have included, because they were brought out on the 15th at night, it would have included the evening or the night and the morning. It would have included the whole 24-hour day. So the 15th day, people who are saying it's not the 15th day, well, the night is the day. And so the day starts at even and it ends at even. And this is another doctrine that's come along with the lunar Sabbath, is the day starts in the morning. That's not biblical. The evening and the morning are the first day, second day, third day. And it's right there. The night is called the day. So they departed from Ramses on the 15th day, and that's when they came out at nighttime. So that part of the night was called the 15th day. Now, A daylight Sabbath from even to even shall ye celebrate your Sabbath. You can see that right in Leviticus 23:32. Even to even, it starts on the 9th at even, and it goes through the 10th. The evening and the morning were the first day. And some of the lunar Sabbath keepers are just saying, well, that's the only day that's even to even, because they can't explain that. That's their only answer. Now, the 15th day of the month was not a weekly Sabbath, but the first one, being the 15th of the month, was an annual Sabbath. So this is an annual Sabbath here, and it's only an annual Sabbath. There's no work, there's no servile work. Servile work means service work. You can't go out and work for somebody. You can fix your little thing in your house, your doorknob, or whatever you'd like to do on those days, but no servile work. You're not going out to serve people. There's on a weekly Sabbath, there's no work at all. You don't even bake your own bread. A wilderness experience. Now, this is what I think is happening with this doctrine. A lot of feast keepers are going back to this. And this doctrine leads us away from God's Sabbath. When God brought them out into the wilderness, he wanted to teach them his Sabbath. Give my people rest. And what's happening is a lot of these people are going back to a lunar Sabbath. And most lunar Sabbath keepers that I know, they don't even observe the day. They don't stop work. They don't observe any Sabbath anymore. A lot of them have given up the Sabbath, and they've narrowed it down to only 12 hours, all kinds of things. And that's what we're doing. Remember, the manna came down for 6 days. They prepared their food on the 6th, and they rested the Sabbath. And it was a continual weekly cycle. It wasn't 6 days, 6 days, 6 days, 6 days, 8 days. The Bible doesn't say that. That's not biblical. He didn't give any instruction about a new moon regarding the Sabbath. When the manna fell down, 6 days you gather the manna, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. Why doesn't it make mention of a lunar Sabbath or a new moon with respect to the manna coming down? Why is there no mention of it? And do we prepare it before a new moon? Now again, you shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations upon the Sabbath day. Exodus 35, verse 3. No kindling fires on the weekly Sabbath. Now Exodus 12, 7 and 10. Regarding the 15th day, it says, they shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire and unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs shall they eat it. Eat not of it raw, nor sodden it at all with water, but roast with fire his head with his legs, and with the purtenance thereof. And ye shall let nothing of it remain until the morning, and that which remaineth of it until the morning ye shall burn with fire. So on the 15th day, what were they doing? Kindling fires. They're kindling fires on the 15th day. So these days, weekly and annual, are obviously different. They have different restrictions, different rules. They're not the same. Numbers 15, 32 and 36 says, while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks upon the Sabbath day, and all the congregation brought him up without the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died as the Lord commanded Moses. Numbers 15, 32 and 36. So this says that there's no gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. That's the weekly Sabbath again. Now what about the annual Sabbath? Can you gather sticks on the annual Sabbath? Is it okay? From what we've learned, there's no servile work, so it is okay. Let's see right here in Leviticus 23 on the 15th day. It says, in the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered the fruit of the land, you shall keep a feast unto the Lord 7 days. On the first day shall be your Sabbath. And ye shall take you on the first day the boughs of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, the boughs of thick trees, and the willows of the brook. You shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that are the Israelites born shall dwell in the booths. So in order to build a booth on the 15th day, what did they have to do? They had to gather sticks. So what does that imply again about this 15th day? It's not the weekly Sabbath, because you're allowed to gather sticks on the weekly Sabbath. You're not allowed to gather sticks on the weekly Sabbath. A man was stoned for it. But these people were commanded by God. Is God telling them to do something right after he tells them not to do it? Is he commanding them the opposite? Is God contradicting himself? God is not looking very good in this situation if he's telling us to keep the lunar Sabbath. Now, on the Sabbath day, 2 lambs, the sacrifices. On the Sabbath day, Numbers 28, 9 and 10, we've got the weekly Sabbath here, and we do have sacrifices on these Sabbaths. 2 lambs, the first year without spot, 2 tenths of flour for meal offering, mingled with oil and drink offering thereof. So there's 2 lambs here to be sacrificed on this day, Numbers 28, 9, and 10. Now what about the other days? The first day, which is the 15th, the annual Sabbath, shall be a convocation. You shall do no manner of servile work therein, but you shall offer a sacrifice made by fire for a burnt offering unto the Lord, 2 young bullocks, 1 ram, and 7 lambs of the first year. They shall be to you without blemish, and 1 goat for a sin offering. So you've got a lot more than 2 lambs on this day. You've got 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 lambs, and 1 goat. And there's different ones for all the days, but particularly the first day and the 7th day, these ones had different offerings. Now, what's the difference between a weekly Sabbath so far and an annual Sabbath? Well, we've got a lot of Bible verses here saying on a weekly Sabbath there's no travel, Jeremiah 17:21. On an annual Sabbath, Exodus 33:2, there's travel commanded. No work, Leviticus 23:3 on a weekly Sabbath, but there's no servile work on an annual Sabbath. No cooking or baking on a weekly Sabbath, number 3, Exodus 16:23, but there's cooking and baking bread on the annual Sabbath, Exodus 12:39. No kindling of fires, Exodus 35:3, but there's kindling fire on Exodus 12:7 and 10, as we're finding out in the Exodus. This could not have been a weekly Sabbath. No gathering sticks, Numbers 15:32 and 36, but God commanded to gather sticks in Leviticus 23:39 and 40. There's a sacrifice of 2 lambs on a weekly Sabbath, and there's a sacrifice of 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 lambs, and a goat on the annual Sabbath. And then there's also the weekly Sabbath has a preparation day, whereas an annual Sabbath has no preparation day. So there's a big difference between this Sabbath and this Sabbath. So when the Israelites came out of Egypt, God did not command them to come out on a weekly Sabbath. There was no travel. He didn't command them. It had to be one of the days of the week. So the 15th could have been either the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, or 6th. But it was not the 7th day. It was not the Sabbath day. So this is not a weekly Sabbath. And now, that really is the one that matters, because that's the first day of the 15th day of the first month. It definitely was an annual Sabbath, but not all annual Sabbaths are weekly Sabbaths. So even if they tried to prove the 2nd and 3rd month in their study, it doesn't matter, because this one here has to be the weekly Sabbath, or else it's over. And so it's not a weekly Sabbath. The annual 15th day is not a weekly Sabbath, and therefore this proves that not all 15th days are weekly Sabbaths. Now let's keep going here. Crucifixion. On the crucifixion, it says he took it down, wrapped it in linen, and laid it in the sepulchre that was hewn in stone, wherein never man before was laid. And that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. And the woman also which came with him from Galilee followed after and beheld the sepulchre, and how his body was laid. And they returned and prepared spices and ointments, and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. So here we have a preparation day on the Passover day. It doesn't always fall. The Passover is not always a preparation day. But the preparation day is only for the weekly Sabbath. So it is true that the crucifixion fell on Friday. It couldn't have been on a Wednesday, as some other people are saying as well. We got to be careful of that, because there's no preparation day for the annual Sabbath. So therefore, if there's no preparation day for that Sabbath, if it's an annual Sabbath on a Wednesday, then the preparation day didn't fall on that day, because there's no preparation for the annual. So the crucifixion had to be on a Friday. Now, historical evidence. It is said by lunar Sabbath observers that Jesus kept the lunar Sabbath, which implies that Jews were keeping it according to the moon at least up to 31 AD. So this is what is said by the lunar Sabbath keepers, that Jesus kept the lunar Sabbath. He didn't keep a weekly 7-day cycle. Now, it is well known and documented fact that by 321 AD, Constantine was enforcing religious observances on Sunday, and that the day was changed from Saturday. The Jews were keeping Saturday. This is well known in history. And this is backed up by numerous historical sources. There's no doubt that Constantine changed it. He didn't change it from a lunar Sabbath to Sunday. He didn't change it to Saturday. He changed it from Saturday to Sunday. And the Jews have been keeping Saturday as a Sabbath for many years before, and I'm going to prove this beyond shadow of a doubt. There is no historical evidence whatsoever to prove that they kept the lunar Sabbath. There's none at all. And I'll get to what is used, okay? Now let's go. The conclusion is made that there was a change from a lunar Sabbath to a 7-day cycle between 31 AD and 321 AD. It had to be made then. It couldn't have been made way beforehand. It had to be made. If they believed Jesus kept the lunar Sabbath, it had to be made from 31 AD to 321. Therefore, we should find historical evidence of a rift and two divisions of Jews during this time. One group that would oppose the day change to Saturday. There had to be some kind of people that said, no way, we're not going to keep Saturday. So where is the historical evidence of two groups? One saying, you know, we shouldn't be changing it from lunar Sabbath to a weekly cycle of Saturday. We can't do this. Where are the arguments against it in history? Was there ever a rift between two sects of a lunar Sabbath change? Is there anything that ever took place? Well, you know, in America, they keep the 4th of July every year. It's an annual day. And if we ever change it to the 4th of June, right, there would be some people that would probably get up in arms almost and say, no way, that day is never going to change. Can you imagine the 7th-day Sabbath of the Jews? That's their national holy day, and it's kept every week. You can't forget this. It's hard to forget this every year, but people are saying that every week they're doing this, and they suddenly forgot to do it one week. A whole nation of people, that can't happen. That's not possible. It's the same thing as changing this to June 4th. There would be people that would be up in arms. They'd get their guns out in America and say, there's no way that you're changing this day to June 4th. There would be writings. We'd have tons of writings on it, two sides, one people saying no, one people saying yes, and we would have that marked in history, and we would never forget that they changed the day to June 4th. It would be marked down in history. Now, what about changing the national holy day of the Jews? You think that really happened? And there's not one piece of evidence written in history from one Jew in all the time that said, hey, not one Jew in all history. See, there's none. There's no letters between sects. There's no divisions between believers. There's no some keeping a lunar Sabbath and some keeping a weekly Sabbath. It never happened because it's not true. The lunar Sabbath never existed. Now, some would say this is historical evidence, and I want to show you one thing here. This is from the Jewish Encyclopedia, Max Joseph, 1906, and there's a few other articles written after 1900. Is this history, though? Is this going way back to history? It's not. This is just recent. This is new, and this is not somebody who's a good source, and I'll show you why he's not a good source in a second. He says the new moon is still, and the Sabbath originally was dependent upon the lunar cycle. And this is used by lunar Sabbath keepers to say the Sabbath must be counted by the moon. Now, Max Joseph wrote this. This is in the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia. Is this good historical evidence? Let's look at it. In another article, he says in 1906, the origin of the Sabbath is obscure. That means I don't know how the Sabbath came to be. It's obscure to me how the Sabbath came to be. Now, where's the origin of the Sabbath in the Bible? Creation. Thank you very much. It's easy to find out, right? We know it originated at creation 6,000 years ago. It's not easy. It's not hard to figure this out. Is this a source that can be trusted historically? He doesn't even know the origin of the Sabbath. Would you trust this as a historic source? Not just that, but he said the origin of the Sabbath, as well as the true meaning of the name, is uncertain. It was probably originally connected in some manner with the call to the moon. Probably, maybe, might have been, could have been. Is that the type of source you want? Somebody who says probably, or do you want something that's written that he knows what he's talking about? Probably connected with the call to the moon, as indeed is suggested by the frequent mention of Sabbath and new moon festivals in the same sentence. So he has no historical evidence to say this. He just says because it's frequently mentioned together. That's not historical proof. That's not historical proof. You have to find people who actually did this. He's saying just because the Bible says Sabbath and new moon in the same sentence, that means that it probably was kept every 7 days according to the moon. That's not historical proof. Now it says, when the Israelites settled into the land and became farmers, their new life would have made it desirable that the Sabbath should come at regular intervals. So when does he say that they started to keep the weekly cycle as a continuous cycle? When they came into the land. That's definitely not a good historical source, because all lunar Sabbath keepers are saying that Constantine changed it. This is 1,400 years before Christ. That's not a good source at all. 1,400 years before Christ, they started keeping a weekly cycle. I don't think I would use that as a source. So there's no historical evidence whatsoever for a lunar Sabbath. There's none, because that's not historical evidence. He has no historical sources to back up. He just says it probably was. That's a might, a maybe. It's not a, I know for sure. It's no, Josephus or Philo or church fathers, Paul the Apostle, Jews. There's nobody. There's no sources he's using. So the change came apparently 1,400 years before Christ, according to that source. Now, do lunar Sabbath keepers want to use that as a reliable source of historical information? Would you guys, as lunar Sabbath keepers, would you guys want to use this as a reliable source? He doesn't know the origin of the Sabbath. I would not want to use that as a historical or reliable source, not at all. And a few people picked up on what he said in there. There's a couple quotes in 1943 of other people who accepted this, but that's all. 1900 stuff after Max Joseph. So I would not use a source that says it was probably originally connected. I would use a source that said it is connected to the new moon. And probably is not good enough for me. Now, Philo, some people say Philo was a lunar Sabbath and he said the Jews were. Let's see what Philo said. He said the nation of the Jews keeps every seventh day regularly after each interval of 6 days. And there is an account of events recorded in the history of creation of the world comprising a sufficient relation of the cause of this ordinance, for the sacred historian says that the world was created in 6 days, and that on the seventh day God desisted from his works and began to contemplate what he had so beautifully created. So what does Philo say? It's a regular 7-day cycle. And this is a historian. This is back to the church fathers. This is before 300 AD. This is before Constantine. It's during the time where they say the change, they were still keeping lunar Sabbaths. I'm going to give you some more evidence of first, second, third history. This is all going to be, let's just say, before the cross. Let's put a little time chart here. And there's sources before and there's sources after that say Saturday was the day that they kept. Now, Ars Era, this is going to be from the Talmud. And it was written in the 1st century, right after Christ. So this is written right around that time. And it says, the new moon is different from a festival. If a new moon falls on a Sabbath, Beth Shammah rules, one recites in his additional prayer 8 benedictions, and Beth Hillel ruled 7. This is indeed a difficulty. Now, if a new moon falls on a Sabbath, I'm going to ask the lunar Sabbath keepers, if a new moon falls on a Sabbath, does a new moon ever fall on a Sabbath? According to the lunar Sabbath? No, right? So why would they be saying in the 1st century if a new moon falls on a Sabbath? Is it possible that maybe the new moon every once in a while fell on the Sabbath back then? Right, it did. It did. So definitely, that's historical evidence. This is the Talmud. There's more. Here's another one. Mishnah, the bones and the sinews and the nothar of the paschal lamb are to be burnt on the 16th. If the 16th falls on a Sabbath, they are to be burnt on the 17th. Now there's another problem right there, because if the 16th falls on a Sabbath, according to a lunar Sabbath keeper, can the Sabbath ever be the 16th? So that can never be a 16th. So there's another big problem, because we got the 16th is sometimes a Sabbath. Otherwise, they wouldn't have wrote that. The 16th used to be on the Sabbath sometimes. The 16th can fall on a Sabbath because we don't believe that, well, any day of the week can be a Sabbath. Any day of the week, or any day of the month, sorry. Any day of the month can be the Sabbath. Now, since the congregation brings on the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles when it falls on a Sabbath, and he continues on, I didn't copy it all, but you guys can go do the history. The first day of Tabernacles when it falls on a Sabbath. You don't say when if it always falls on the Sabbath. It can sometimes fall on the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath. So sometimes it's weekly, but it's always annual, the 15th, but it's not always weekly. It's not always a weekly Sabbath. So that definitely, the lunar Sabbath does not always go on the 1st, 8th, 15th, etc. That's not biblical. That's not historical. It never happened. There's no historical evidence whatsoever. It's never happened. This is a new doctrine that's come in, and it's bringing a lot of people into, I believe, deception. You can't prove it from the Bible, and you can't prove it from history. Again, the Talmud, they debated about almost everything. I don't take it as a source of proof of how to keep your doctrine, but I would say historical proof, it's definitely there that they had rules that they went by. Probably man-made rules, but they knew that the Sabbath did not always fall on the 15th. That was historically true. But they debated about almost everything. And something as major as a change of when the Sabbath is observed ought to at least have been mentioned somewhere. If some people are keeping it by the lunar or the moon, and some people are keeping it as a weekly regular cycle, why is there no mention of it anywhere of some kind of rift between two groups? They should have had it in the Talmud, but it wasn't there because they debated everything in that book, everything. You can find debates on Pentecost, whether it fell on the first 50th day, the first day of the 16th, or Sunday. They had those debates. Never debated this issue because it wasn't there. There was no debate. It was always a weekly continual cycle from creation. Now, another historical source, and this is 330 AD. I had a bunch of stuff I could have used, but there are people called Jews. This is in the time of Alexander the Great, and it talks about the defeat of Ptolemy. It's 330 years before Christ, way before Christ. And it says, there are people called the Jews that dwell in the city of the strongest of all other cities, which the inhabitants call Jerusalem, and are accustomed to rest on every 7th day. On which times they make no use of their arms, nor meddle with husbandry, nor take care of any affairs of life, but spread out their hands in their holy places and pray till the evening. Now it came to pass that when Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, came into this city with his army, that these men, in observing this mad custom of theirs, instead of guarding the city, suffered their country to submit itself to a bitter lord. So what happened on the Sabbath day? It was done away. But they said they kept it every 7th day. So they knew when they were going to keep their 7th day. Now watch. Here's another one. From a spot on the top of the temple chambers, a priest would blow a trumpet on Sabbath eve. So when does he blow the trumpet historically? And this is written in 94 AD. Did they blow it in the morning to start the Sabbath or in the evening? The evening, right. The Sabbath begins at evening, not the morning. It's not a daylight Sabbath. And this is historical. To announce the arrival of the Sabbath and the cessation of labor, and to announce on the following evening the departure of the Sabbath and the resumption of all labor. So evening to evening. The entire city was visible from this spot on the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. The clarion call of the trumpet would reach the furthest markets of the city. Such a scene is recounted by Josephus in his work, The Jewish War. So Josephus recounted this, how they kept the Sabbath even to even. But furthermore, here's Josephus' War of the Jews. It says, the last was erected above the top of the Pastaphoria, where one of the priests stood, of course, and gave a signal beforehand with a trumpet at the beginning of the Sabbath day in the evening at twilight. So evening to evening again. These are first century eyewitnesses. This is just after Jesus was alive. As also the evening, when that day was finished, as giving notice to the people when they were to stop work and when they were to go to work again. Now, he continues and he says, nor had the Romans succeeded in their endeavors, and had Pompey taken notice of the 7 days on which the Jews abstained from all sorts of work on a religious account, and raised his bank, but restrained his soldiers from fighting on those days, for the Jews only acted defensively on Sabbath days. Now note, they only acted defensively on Sabbath days, so they would defend their city on the Sabbath days, but would they act offensively? Would they go to war chasing Romans, chasing other nations? Would they ever act offensively? No. They only act defensively. That's from Josephus. Now, again, from Josephus, he says in another book, he says, the Jews went on pursuing the Romans as far as Antipas, after which, seeing they could not override them, they came back and took the engine and spoiled the dead bodies and gathered the prey together, which the Romans had left behind them. This defeat happened on the 8th day of the month, Deus. Now, when you read this, in the 12th year of the reign of Nero, 8th day of the month, according to a lunar Sabbath keeper, the 8th day of the month is a weekly Sabbath. Did the Jews ever pursue on a weekly Sabbath? Did they ever pursue offensively? They didn't chase the Romans on a weekly Sabbath, so therefore the 8th day of the month there is not a weekly Sabbath, because they weren't doing offense on a weekly Sabbath according to Josephus. Now, more historical evidence, and this is from 63 BC. Just shortly after Christ, Paul the Apostle was alive here. Now it says, as it was made then, as it was, they made an excavation of what are called the days of Saturn, and by doing no work at all on those days, afforded the Romans an opportunity in this interval to batter down the wall. So what day did they not work on? The day of Saturn? Saturday, that's right. Now, that might be associated with their gods, Saturn. So is Sunday, right? And a lunar Sabbath might keep Sunday or Saturday or whatever day it falls on, but that's not what we keep. We keep the 7th day. So the 7th day falls on Saturday. It's not that we keep Saturday. We keep Friday evening to Saturday evening. Now, this is proof that the Jews were keeping the 7th day in line with Saturday before Christ came, and all the nations around knew it. There's absolute proof here that in Christ's day, they were keeping Saturday on a weekly cycle every week. There's no historical evidence that they kept a lunar Sabbath. Another one, the Jews indeed had done much injury to the Romans, but they suffered far more themselves. The first of them to be captured were those who were fighting for the precept of their God, and then the rest of the day, even then called the day Saturn. Now this is 36 BC. So this is 36 years before Christ, right? And it says that they were keeping Saturn again back here. So excessive were they in their devotion to religion that the first set of prisoners, those who had been captured along with the temple, obtained leave from Socius. When the day of Saturn came round again and went up into the temple, and there performed all the customary rites together with the rest of the people. So here again, the day of Saturday is observed as a day of rest 36 years before Christ. This proves that in the time of Christ, this was not always a Sabbath every 15th day, because they were keeping Saturday. Furthermore, they deified Augustus. Vespasian attacked the Jews on the day of Saturn, a day on which it is sinful for them to do any business. And there's numerous talks of when they attacked the Jews in different times. And they would always attack on Saturday, Saturn, the day of Saturn to them, which is the Sabbath for the Jews. It was always that way. And I only gave a little bit of historical evidence. I could keep going and going and going because it's all there. There is no historical evidence that they did not keep Saturday. They absolutely kept it every week on a weekly cycle. Here's from the Dead Sea Scrolls. They brought these up, the Mishmarot text of the priestly service text. It's a Hebrew term meaning watches, and is used in an instance as a reference to 24 watches of courses of the Levitical priesthood. It says, on the first day of the week of Jediah, which falls on the 12th in the 7th month. Now, if I was to fall on the first day of the week would be on a 12th, so 12th right here. This would be the first day. But according to a lunar Sabbath keeper, what day should it be? The 12th. It should be the 4th. Right. So that's not, apparently they weren't keeping a lunar Sabbath back then. And another one, on the 5th day of the week, on Imor, which falls on the 23rd day of the 10th month. So the 23rd day was the 5th day, which would be this day. And we would have the 5th day. What day is that supposed to be according to the lunar Sabbath keeper? It's the 1st, right? So looking at all these things and we're saying, wow, they don't fall in line with the lunar Sabbath. Historical evidence proves that beyond a shadow of doubt there was no time where they ever kept the lunar Sabbath, and there was no big spiff where they broke off and started keeping a weekly Sabbath according to a cycle. That cycle has been continuous since creation. And to go off on that is like taking the mark of the beast. If the Sabbath is the mark of the beast, as most of us understand, then what you're doing is you're going off. I do believe we should keep the new moons and the Sabbaths. Okay, thank you. Now ask yourself, if you are a lunar Sabbath keeper, the obvious question for you is, if the Jews before Christ through the 1st and 2nd centuries kept the lunar Sabbath and only later adopted what you call the Roman week, why did the 1st century Romans keep saying the Jewish Sabbath is on their day of Saturn? Why do they keep doing that? The obvious answer to the obvious question is that the 1st century Jews, including Christ and his disciples, kept the same recurring 7-day week as the Romans. It was in line, and they knew that Sabbath fell on Saturday. It's historical fact. It's proven that the same week and day exists to this day and has never changed. It's never changed throughout history. Horne's Instruction, Volume 1 says, one of the most striking collateral confirmations of the Mosaic history of the creation is the general adoption of the division of time into weeks. Almost everybody does it, which extends from the Christian states of Europe to the remote shores of Hindustan and has equally prevailed among the Hebrews, Egyptians, Chinese, Greeks, Romans, and northern barbarians. Nations, some who have had little or no communication with others and were not even known by name to the Hebrews. So almost all the world keeps Sabbath, and they didn't even know the Hebrews. But yet, you'll notice that almost in every language of the world, what do they call their Saturday? Shabbat, Subota, Sabbath, Sabbat. Everywhere you go. I think in the Philippines they have some, I don't know what it is. Sabado? Okay, so basically, that's the name of Saturday everywhere in the world. They've adopted it, and they were hardly known to the Hebrews. How did this happen? Because the 7th day has always fallen on Shabbat, and it came from ancient times. It's been since the beginning. Now, we do know that somebody thinks to change times and laws. That's the papacy. We have this documented in history. That is, the papacy changed what? The Catholic Church, by virtue of her divine mission, changed the day from Saturday to Sunday. Okay? It wasn't changed from an annual lunar Sabbath to Sunday. There's no historical evidence or no historical proof of this. It never happened. There's no change from lunar Sabbath. The history hasn't been burned up and all the people killed. There would be proof of this. We would know of wars with the Jews. The Jews would be fighting for their lives for the Sabbath day. They'd be fighting for their lives. It wouldn't happen. So summarizing, the new moon is a holy day that was kept by the Jews, and it's going to be kept in heaven. It was not nailed to the cross, as some believe. Number 2, the annual Sabbaths of the feasts are kept on the 15th day of the 1st month and 7th month. Those are annual Sabbaths. They're not weekly Sabbaths always. These are different than the weekly Sabbath, and sometimes they fall on weekly Sabbaths, sometimes they don't. The Jews came out of Egypt on the 15th of the 1st month, but it was an annual Sabbath, but not a weekly Sabbath. On this Sabbath, they could bake, they could make fire, they could travel, but they were to do no servile work. They were allowed to cook on these days. The weekly Sabbath has a preparation day, number 4. No work at all is to be done on this day. No cooking, no fires, no kindling fires, no traveling. Can't happen. History documents that the Jews never kept the 8th and 15th, etc. of the month as holy days, number 5. Number 6, history as well as the Bible documented that the Sabbath began at sunset and not in the morning, as some are coming to believe. The lunar Sabbatarians are coming to believe in this sunrise to sunset. 7, lunar Sabbath believers get their historical documentation from unreliable sources such as Max Joseph. That's not a reliable historical source. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and he said it himself. 8, changing the national holy day of the Jews from a lunar Sabbath would have been protested. It would have been protested by the Jews, and the writings concerning it would have been well documented. We'd have numerous writings to show it changed from a lunar Sabbath to a weekly Sabbath. Number 9, the Bible does not say anywhere to use the moon to start the Sabbath cycle. It's assumed, and it's all assumption, and that's it. It's not biblical, it's not historical. It's a new doctrine that's come into us as a people, and we need to be on our guard in understanding the Bible and understanding history in order to be able to show our brethren and bring them back to the truth of the Sabbath.